sleepy Fenland villages like this. It's a very closed community, it's very quiet, we all know everybody else. So when something like this actually happens, it's scary because you don't know if it's someone in the village who's just sort of blown a fuse and just randomly killed two people, or if it's someone out there with a purpose.
Everybody in the local community was frightened at the time because no one knew who did it, whether it was a local person, someone had just come into the area. No one knew who it was.
Where you have someone who's a psychopath, who has no capacity for guilt whatsoever, combined with high intelligence, there's every reason to believe that the person would be looking seemingly normal from the outside. So the first rule was don't say, oh, he's a nice chap, therefore let's exclude him, because quite probably it could be a complete false image that is portrayed to most people.
For 3 weeks, forensic teams combed the crime scene for vital clues. Police were convinced the room where the bodies were found held all the answers.
The crime scene is extremely important to any major investigation, and particularly a murder. And in this particular instance, with the murder taking place inside a house which is controlled from the elements, there was a great opportunity for us. There is so much information contained within that scene that it's absolutely essential that we take the maximum from it.
Everything you do has implications further down the line, and you only have one chance of taking the samples, one shot at it, and you can't go back. The forensic potential with respect to Janice was greater. Her clothing had been displaced, her feet had been bound, and so we had good reason to believe there was a lot of contact by the murderer. Once you see what has happened to the bodies, so you start thinking about the sequence of events. If there's stabbing injuries, you'll be thinking about, could the murderer have left his DNA behind? Could he have cut himself while he was stabbing the person? Could he have had contact? Could he have left body fluids, saliva, semen, anywhere on the body? So as a result of that, we took some samples from her breast and we took the tape from her legs. And in this case, we used specialist techniques to bring up fingerprints or footwear marks that you couldn't see with the naked eye.
Very early on in the investigation, in terms of the forensic evidence, what was particularly interesting and exciting was this thumb mark, which was found in the front room on the hearth, very, very close to where Janice's head was. So we were very, very interested in this mark.
I was absolutely convinced that the donor of that thumb mark was the person who'd murdered Janice and Constance. But there was other evidence, forensic evidence, that had been gathered.
The real breakthrough was when we did DNA analysis on the breast swabs from Janice. We found naturally DNA from Janice there, but there was traces of DNA from a man, tiny, tiny traces, which were obviously of key interest. But the downside was that there wasn't enough to identify who that was, and we just had to be patient and had to wait.
There was further frustration for the police, as a thumbprint found on the hearth failed to match any existing criminal records. With seemingly nothing to go on, what was baffling them most was how did the killer get into the home of these two intensely private women?
I don't think Mum would have let anybody in that she was suspicious of, because Mum was very astute. Janice was the same. She wouldn't have had time for any silly talk.
I never went into the house, and on each occasion I'd knock on the back fence and a gate. You would hear the back door unlock, and she'd come out and almost guard the entrance to the house.
Fire crews took 6 hours to put out the blaze, and the next day Rosemary Griffin and her partner...
There was no forced entry to the scene, which means I'm absolutely convinced that the person was invited in.
We knew she wouldn't have had anybody else in there unless she knew them. So it was hard to think that the person they'd actually let inside their home, they knew but didn't realise what awful thing was going to happen.
Most murders, really, we start looking at associates, friends, associates, and that's because statistically there is some previous contact, some previous knowledge between the murderer and the victim.
Desperate to catch their man, police now decided to focus their efforts on the local Fenland community. They began by paying particular attention to anyone who'd had any contact with Janice and Connie.
We were firmly of the opinion it was somebody who lived locally, or perhaps had lived locally, or somebody who regularly visited the area. And the two particular groups of people we were interested in at that stage were the Whippet fraternity, because of Janice and Constance's interest in whippets, and the fishing fraternity. We do know that Janice walked her dogs on a very regular basis, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. And of course, she'd walk along Pingle Road, across Pingle Bridge, where invariably she would see the fishermen. So in terms of witnesses, they were a group of people we were particularly interested in.
Police were determined to leave no stone unturned. Suspicion fell on Janice Sheridan's friend and employer, John Bromley.
And it was pretty heavy during the police questioning because they had no clues or anything, and I suppose I was the #1 suspect. But when you're being looked at for a double murder and your whole life is put under a microscope, it's a pretty harrowing thing. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone. A lot of people in the community thought it was me. Suspicions, gossip. You'd walk into a local shop or the post office or the garage and everyone would stop speaking. And that was pretty nasty.
So obviously there was an aura of suspicion over us, and I can understand why people felt like that, because we'd been so close to Jan. Yes, and it was quite a frightening time for us.
4 weeks after Janice and Connie were murdered, and after questioning anyone who had come into contact with them, police were no closer to catching the killer. Still convinced he was a local man, concern was growing that he would strike again.
It's fair to say that you do feel a sense of responsibility, and there is that pressure on you, because with the best will in the world, you just can't predict whether this person is going to kill again.
Anyone capable of committing a crime of this outrageous, horrendous nature, so calmly, so coolly, and without any remorse, is entirely capable of doing it again.
Six weeks after the brutal murders of Connie and Janice Sheridan, their killer was still on the loose. Police feared he was already looking for his next victim.
If someone has committed a crime of that monstrous and extreme proportions, they are extremely dangerous. What tends to happen is that they live off the memory of the most recent crime, where it is clearly enacted to gratify fantasy. But sooner or later, the memory will lose its bloom, and it's time to sort of add a new one to the repertoire. Question then is, what's sooner, what's later? Well, given the forensic awareness of this particular individual, it would be when the next opportunity arose where somebody who was in a similar category, vulnerable, likely not to be found quickly, and therefore they could become the next vehicle for his fantasy.
I locked my doors. I made sure that my doors were locked even more securely after that.
I think people did lock their doors, but there was a murderer on the loose. I think people were more diligent about security.
At a news conference, Norfolk Police announced a reward of £25,000 for information which will lead to the killer.
We really did hope, because we were convinced, in particular, that the murderer was known to Janice and Constance, that this would be a good way of teasing out that a little bit of extra information which would lead us directly to that murderer.
We were still looking for a breakthrough. We were still looking for that needle in a haystack.
70 officers were now working on the case, but the investigation was going nowhere, and they still had no clear suspects. Under pressure, the police decided to take more drastic measures.
By the middle of April, we still hadn't identified the thumb mark on the hearth by Janice's head. So we took the step of undertaking a mass fingerprint screen, which included the whole of Upwell village and the surrounding area.
Everyone in the community who was over the age of 12, male or female, was fingerprinted. Our girls were fingerprinted.
The local community were very, very receptive, and everybody cooperated with this fingerprint screen. Nobody objected to their fingerprints being taken.
With the mass fingerprinting well underway, police decided to step up the search and turn their attentions once again to the dog world. Janice and Connie had been regular visitors to Crufts, and still convinced they'd known their attacker, police went to Britain's biggest dog show. Would the killer be there?
The police did sort of stay in the background, but they had a place and store, and it was announced also that the police were there and looking for anybody who might have some information. Would they please come forward?
It was quite a sad occasion because it was an environment that they were used to being in and obviously very happy in, and we could only remember with sadness that they weren't there to enjoy it.
In the year the Sheridans were killed, Janice had high hopes for one of her dogs, Dylan, and as a mark of respect, a friend decided to show him on her behalf.
Dylan, I think, was everything she'd waited to happen. He was everything that she wanted in a dog.